The first bullet took the hat off Amos Vetch's head before the dust from the horse's hooves had settled on the porch boards. It was a clean shot, and it lifted the hat like a bird off a wire and sent it spinning into the street, where it landed crown down in the wheel rut. Before we go any deeper into this valley, tell me where you're listening from tonight. I'd like to know the places this story reaches: a kitchen in Texas, a farmhouse in the Karoo, a little flat in Oslo, a porch in the Philippines. Say it in the comments, and I'll read every single one. The rider sat his horse in the middle of Main Street with the smoke curling off his pistol barrel. He was young, maybe 30, with a face that had never been hit. His name was Vance Odell, and he'd come up from the south with a reputation that arrived a week before he did, the way bad weather does. Behind him, the land baron Thaddeus Grimm's new fence posts stood like teeth, waiting to swallow the valley. The whole of Whetstone had gone quiet. The barber stopped mid-snip, his scissors frozen over a customer's ear, humming the same hymn he always hummed when he was afraid. The blacksmith came to his door with his big scarred hands hanging loose, and he didn't say a word, because he never did in trouble. The sheriff stepped out of his office and thumbed the badge on his chest, once, twice, the way he did when he was deciding which side of a thing he could afford to stand on. And Amos Vetch, 67 years old, orchard keeper, widower, a man the town had stopped seeing years ago, stood in the middle of the street with his head bare and his hands at his sides, and he did not reach for anything. Odell laughed. It was a good laugh, practiced, the laugh of a man who'd learned that laughing first made everything else easier. "Old man," he called out, "I figured a hat that old ought to be put out of its misery. You're welcome." He holstered his pistol with a flourish and waited for the town to be afraid, and the town obliged him. Amos walked to the wheel rut and picked up his hat. He turned it over in his hands. The bullet had gone through the crown, a small dark hole like a seed that had been planted and hadn't grown. He brushed the dust off with his sleeve, the way he'd done 1,000 times coming in from the orchard. Then he looked up at the rider, and his voice was so quiet that the whole street leaned in to hear it. "My wife gave me that hat." Odell's laugh faltered, just for a second, the way a flame falters in a draft. "Then she's got poor taste in hats," he said, and he tossed a silver dollar into the street, where it landed at Amos's feet and rolled in a slow circle before falling over. "Buy yourself a new one. Tell her the Gunslinger sent it." He turned his horse and rode down Main Street, and the town let out its breath all at once, like a held long. The barber's scissors stopped. The blacksmith went back inside. The sheriff thumbed his badge once more and went back into his office, and nobody asked him what he'd seen, because everybody knew he'd seen nothing. Amos Vetch stood in the street with his ruined hat in his hands and the silver dollar at his feet, and he did not pick it up. He left it there, shining in the sun like a small, bright insult, and walked home to his orchard with his head bare. His orchard. 40 years of grafting and pruning and waiting, of tying young branches to stakes and whispering to trees the way other men whispered to horses. Every tree had been put in the ground by his own 2 hands, grafted onto rootstock he'd raised himself from seed, because he believed a tree grew truest when grafted onto something hardy, something that had already survived a winter or two. His wife Martha used to say he talked to the trees more than he talked to her, and he'd say the trees answered back, and she'd laugh. That laugh was the sound he'd carried through every winter since she died, 5 years gone now. The orchard was where he went now, with his hat in his hands. He stood among the rows and looked at the young grafts, the ones that would bear their first fruit in another year or 2 if the frost held off. And he thought about the man on the horse and the notice on the saloon door that morning, printed in Grimm's own hand, telling every family along the river their land was wanted, that the valley would be flooded for a reservoir, that the water rights were Grimm's by law, and that anyone who stayed would be standing in the way of progress. Progress. Amos had heard that word before. It was what men called it when they wanted what you had and didn't want to call it stealing. He looked down at the hat in his hands. Martha had given it to him on their 20th anniversary, a good felt hat with a band she'd stitched from a strip of her mother's old dress, and she'd made him promise to wear it every day. And he had, for 25 years, through sun and snow and the long quiet years after she was gone. It was the last thing she'd ever given him, the last thing she'd ever touched. And now there was a hole in it, and a silver dollar in the street, and a young man with a practiced laugh who thought that was the end of the story. Amos Vetch set the hat on the fence post, hole and all, and went into the house. But he did not get far. At the north edge of his land, where the orchard met the river, he found the new posts. Grim's men had driven them in that afternoon, and between them ran 3 strands of wire that cut him off from the water. His water, the water that had fed his trees for 40 years. The fence did not say anything, but it did not have to. It said everything. Amos Vetch stood there in the failing light, an old man with a ruined hat and a fenced river, and he did not know yet what he was going to do. But he knew, with a certainty that sat in his chest like a stone, that the story was not over. Somewhere down the road, the man on the horse was going to find out what it meant to shoot a hat that a dead woman had given her husband. The question was whether Amos would be the one to teach him, and what it would cost. The offer came the next morning, carried not by a lawyer but by Thaddeus Grimm himself, which was its own kind of message. Grimm did not ride. He drove a black carriage behind a matched pair of bays, stepped down onto the orchard road in boots that had never once been wet by a field, and stood looking at Amos Vetch's trees the way a man looks at a thing he has already decided to own. "Mr. Vetch," he said, and his voice was unhurried, the voice of a man who had never once been made to hurry. "I've come to make you a fair offer." Amos stood at the orchard gate with the ruined hat on the fence post behind him. He said nothing. Grimm named a number, more money than Amos Vetch had seen in his life, and he said it the way other men said good morning. "I don't want your money," Amos said. "Everybody wants money, Mr. Vetch. They just don't always know it yet." He gestured at the orchard with one gloved hand. "These trees have maybe 10 good years left in them. 15 if you're lucky, and the blight stays away. I'm offering you the price of 30 good years for a piece of land that's going underwater whether you sign or not. The reservoir is coming, the county has approved it, and the water rights are mine. The only question is whether you walk away rich or watch the water take it anyway." Amos looked at the trees. The morning light was coming through them, and the young grafts at the north end were holding up their new leaves like small green hands. "My wife planted the first of these with me," Amos said. 40 years ago. We put it in the ground the week we were married. I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Vetch. Truly. But sentiment doesn't hold water." He took a folded paper from his coat and held it out. "This is the deed to the water rights, signed and recorded 9 years ago. The valley's water belongs to my company. I'm not asking you to give me anything. I'm asking you to take something." Amos did not take the paper. He looked past Grimm, down the road, at the new fence posts and the wire that had cut him off from the river. "And if I don't sign? Then you'll be standing in the way of progress, Mr. Vetch. And progress, in my experience, does not wait for old men." Grimm climbed back into his carriage and drove away, and the folded paper lay in the dust, a white square like a headstone. Amos Vetch did not pick it up. The town heard about it by noon. That was the way of Whetstone. News traveled by porch and by fence and by the barber's scissors, and the whole town knew that Amos Vetch had refused Grimm's offer, and that the refusal meant the town would have to choose a side. Eli the barber came that afternoon with his scissors in his pocket and him humming in his throat, and he stood among the trees and said, "Amos, I've cut your hair for 30 years. I'll cut it for 30 more. But I want you to know, if you fight this thing, you fight it alone. I've got a wife and 3 children and a shop mortgaged to the bank Grimm owns." "I know," Amos said. "I'm not proud of it," Eli said. "I'm just telling you the truth." And Cobb the blacksmith came that evening, and he stood in the doorway of the barn with his big scarred hands hanging loose, and he said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "My father worked the forge in this town for 50 years. He never once bent his back to a man with money. He'd want me to tell you he'd have stood with you." Amos looked at him. "And you?" Cobb looked at his hands. "I'm still deciding," he said. And that was the most honest thing anyone had said to Amos all day. The one who surprised him was Ruth Calloway. Ruth ran the dry goods store, a widow in her 50s with a face gone sharp from grief and a ledger she kept like a holy book. She came to the orchard after supper, when the light was going blue, and she did not come to offer comfort. She came with a folder of papers. "I've been keeping the town's records for 20 years, she said. "Births, deaths, deeds, water claims. Nobody asks me to, nobody thanks me for it, but I keep them, because somebody has to remember, and I've watched this town forget itself twice already." She opened the folder and laid out a copy of Grimm's water rights claim. "Look at the date," she said. 9 years ago, it says. But the man who signed it over, old Judge Harlow, died 11 years ago. I remember because I kept the record of his death myself. I wrote it in my own hand. Amos looked at the paper, then at her. You're saying the deed's a forgery. I'm saying the date doesn't match the death I recorded, Ruth said. A man can't sign away water rights 2 years after he's buried. But proving it will cost money and lawyers and time. And Grimm owns the judge who'd hear the case. And the only copy of the original deed sits in the county records office. She closed the folder. I'm not telling you to fight, Amos. I'm telling you that if you're going to fight, you'd better fight with paper, because that's the only kind of war an honest man can win in this county. Amos stood in the blue light, and he thought about Martha, and the hat, and the fence, and the offer lying in the dust. He thought about the easy road, paved and short and leading somewhere warm, and the hard road, which ran through the county records office and the courthouse and the gunslinger's laugh. He looked at Ruth Calloway, at her sharp face and her holy ledger, and he said, "Why do you care what happens to my orchard?" Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Because somebody has to remember, Amos. And I'd rather remember a man who stood than a man who sold." The next morning, the notice went up on the saloon door. It was printed in Grimm's own hand, and it gave the families along the river 30 days to vacate, and it named Amos Vetch's orchard first, because Grimm was a man who liked to make examples. And that night, someone cut the wire on Grimm's new fence, one strand at the north edge, where the orchard met the river. Nobody saw who did it. Cobb swore he was at his forge. Eli swore he was at his scissors. And Amos Vetch stood in his orchard in the dark and did not ask any questions, because he knew, the way a man knows the weather, that the town was beginning to lean. But he also knew that leaning was not standing, and that 30 days was not a long time, and that the gunslinger with the practiced laugh was still out there, waiting to be sent. Ask yourself, before you go on, what would you have done if the world came for the only thing you had left, and the easy road was paved and short, and the hard road ran through a gunslinger's laugh? Because the answer to that question is the whole of this story. The storm did not come from the sky. It came on a Tuesday, in the 3rd week of the 30 days, riding a black horse down Main Street at noon, and it wore Vance Odell's practiced smile. Grimm had sent his messenger, and his messenger had brought the message, and the message was not a notice. It was an order. Odell rode straight to the orchard and sat his horse at the gate, and he looked at the ruined hat still hanging on the fence post, and he laughed, a short flat laugh. And he said, "You still got that hat, old man. I thought I told you to buy a new one." Amos came out of the barn. He had been grafting, and his hands were green with the sap of the young wood, and he stood in the sun with his sleeves rolled and looked up at the rider. "The water's coming," Odell said. "Mr. Grimm's being generous. He's giving you 1 more week to sign. After that, we start clearing the flood line." He nodded at the orchard. "These trees come down, then the house, then the fence, and then the water comes up and covers whatever's left. That's the order of it. That's progress." Amos said nothing. He looked at his hands, at the sap drying green on his knuckles, and he thought about the young grafts at the north end, the ones that would bear their first fruit next year. Odell leaned down from the saddle. "I've seen men like you before, old man. Stubborn, proud, think their land's worth more than their life." He straightened. "Here's the thing about men like you. You always wait until it's too late. You wait until the water's at your door, and then you stand on the porch and shake your fist at the flood, and the flood doesn't even notice." He turned his horse and rode back toward town, and Amos stood in the orchard and watched him go, and he knew, with a certainty that sat cold in his chest, that the week would not be enough. That night, the fire came. Amos smelled it before he saw it, a sharp green smell, the smell of wet wood burning, and he came out of the house in his nightshirt and ran barefoot down the rows. And at the north end of the orchard, where the young grafts stood, the fire was already moving, a low, hungry line of it running along the dry grass between the rows, and the young trees were going up one by one, their new leaves curling and blackening in the heat. He ran at the fire. The heat came at him in a wall, and the ash rode the air like snow, and he could taste the smoke at the back of his throat and hear the roar of it filling his ears. He had no water, no bucket, no tool, nothing but his 2 hands and his old man's heart, and he beat at the flames with his shirt until the shirt was gone, and then he beat at them with his bare arms, and the fire burned him, and he did not feel it, because all he could see was the young trees, the ones he had grafted with his own hands, the ones that would never now bear their first fruit. The men beat at the flames until their arms gave out, and the smoke rolled over the orchard and up into the dark, and somewhere a dog was barking and would not stop. Eli's scissors were gone from his pocket, lost somewhere in the black, and he kept humming his hymn without knowing he was doing it. By the time Cobb and Eli and the other men of the town came running with buckets and shovels, the fire had taken the north end. 31 young trees, gone. The grafts Amos had put in last spring, the ones he had whispered to, the ones he had promised would carry Martha's orchard into the next generation, all of them black and smoking in the dawn. Cobb stood among the ruins with a shovel in his hands, and he looked at Amos's burned arms, and he said, "We'll plant them again, Amos. We'll plant them all again." Amos looked at the black rose. "No," he said, "we won't, because they'll just burn them again and again and again until there's nothing left to burn." He walked back to the house, and he did not look at the ruins again, and he went into the barn and stood in the dark among the tools, and he looked at the axe on the wall, and he looked at his burned hands, and he thought about the gunslinger's laugh and the deed, and the sheriff who thumbed his badge and saw nothing. He stood in the barn and listened to his own breathing and to the settling of the ashes outside, and he thought about what Martha would say, and he knew, with a grief that sat in his chest like a second heart, that she would not want this, and that he did not know what else was left. And for the first time in 67 years, Amos Vetch thought about picking up a weapon. He stood there a long time. The axe hung on the wall in the dark, and the smell of the fire came in through the open door, and Amos Vetch, who had never thrown a punch in his life, reached up and took the axe down from the wall. He did not swing it. He held it, and he looked at it, and he thought about what it would mean, and then he heard, very faintly, from the direction of the house, a sound that stopped him cold. It was the sound of the porch door opening, and a voice, low and unhurried, said, "Put the axe down, old man. You don't want to do that." Vance Odell stood in the barn door, his pistol in his hand, and the dawn light came in behind him and threw his shadow long across the floor, and he looked at Amos Vetch holding the axe, and he shook his head, almost sadly. "I was sent to make sure you understood the message," he said, "but I didn't expect to find you holding an axe." He stepped forward. "Put it down, old man. I'd hate to shoot a man who's already lost everything." Amos looked at the axe in his hands. He looked at the gunslinger, and the question that hung in the barn between them, in the smoke and the dawn, was not whether Amos would put the axe down. It was whether, if he did, he would ever be able to pick it up again. Ruth Calloway came at first light, before the town was awake, with a roll of clean bandages in her hand and her sharp face set against the morning. She found Amos sitting on the porch with his ruined hat in his lap, his burned arms wrapped in strips torn from an old sheet, and she did not ask him what had happened, because she already knew. "Sit still," she said. She knelt and unwrapped his arms, and the burns were red and raw, and she cleaned them with water from the well and bound them with the clean bandages, and her hands were steady and sure, the hands of a woman who had done this before, and Amos washed her hands and thought about Martha, and the thought did not hurt the way it usually did. "You're going to be all right," she said. "The burns will heal. They always do." Amos looked at her. "You've done this before." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "My husband," she said. "He was a timberman. He came home with his hands cut to the bone more times than I can count. I got good at it." She finished the last bandage and sat back on her heels. "And then my son, when he was old enough, went to work the same timber, and I bound his hands the same way. And then one winter the timber took them both, the father and the son, in the same week, and I buried them side by side, and I have not bound another wound since then. Until now." Amos looked at her, and he saw, for the first time, the shape of the grief she carried, the same shape as his own, worn different but cut from the same cloth. "I'm sorry," he said. "Don't be," she said. "Grief's not something you apologize for. It's something you carry." She stood up and looked out at the blackened north end of the orchard, at the 31 dead trees standing like burned soldiers in the morning light. "And it's something you decide what to do with." She looked down at him. "I went to the county records office last night," she said. "I told the clerk I was updating the town ledger. He let me in. I found the original deed, the one Judge Harlow signed 11 years ago. And I found my own death record, the one I wrote in my own hand. And I put them side by side with the paper Grimm's company filed, and the dates do not match, Amos. They cannot both be true." Amos sat very still. The morning was coming up over the black trees, and the light was gold and wrong. and he held his ruined hat in his burned hands, and he did not speak for a long time. "It's proof," Ruth said. "It's the proof we need. But proof is only paper, Amos. Paper has to be carried into a room full of men who don't want to believe it, and it has to be laid out in front of them, and somebody has to stand behind it. And the man who stands behind it has to be you, because it's your water, your orchard, your name on the record. I can carry the paper. I can't carry the standing." Amos looked at the folder she held out. He looked at his burned hands. He looked at the black trees, and the ruined hat, and the fence, and the river that was still his, that had always been his. He took the folder. "Thank you, Ruth," he said, "for remembering." She looked at him, and there was something in her face he had not seen before, something that had been locked up a long time. "Somebody has to remember," she said. "That's what I told you. But I think what I meant was, somebody has to be remembered. And I'd rather be remembered standing beside a man who stood than sitting alone in a store full of dry goods." The silence between them was long and full, and neither of them reached for it, and neither of them needed to. Amos looked down at the hat in his hands, at the hole in the crown, and he said, very quietly, "She gave me this hat so I'd have something of her to wear into the world. I wore it every day for 25 years. I don't know how to stand in the world without it now." Ruth looked at him, and her sharp face softened, and she said, "Then don't stand without it. Wear it, hole and all. It's still her hat, Amos. It's still her. If you're feeling what I'm feeling right now, if this story has put a hand on your shoulder somewhere along the way, then do me a kindness and hit that like button. And if you want to walk with me through more of these valleys, subscribe. I'll be here, telling stories for people who remember. Now let me finish this one." Nobody ever asked Amos who cut the wire, and he never said. And when the town began to whisper that it must have been the old man himself, he let them whisper, because letting them believe it would have made him a hero, and he had not done it, and he would not wear a thing he had not earned. Ruth Calloway saw that he did not correct them, and she saw that he did not confirm it either, and she said nothing, because she understood that a man who will not take credit he hasn't earned is a man who can be trusted with the truth. Amos Vetch, who had never raised his voice in anger in his life, who had never thrown a punch, who had stood in his barn with an axe in his hands and put it back on the wall, because he was not that man, walked to the fence post and took down his ruined hat, and he put it on his head, hole and all, and he walked down the orchard road toward the county seat, and the town came out of its houses to watch him go, and nobody said a word, because there was nothing to say. Cobb the blacksmith stood in his doorway with his scarred hands hanging loose, and he watched Amos pass, and he said, quietly, to no one, "There goes the man we should have been standing with all along." The hearing was held in the county seat, in a courthouse that smelled of old paper and floor wax. The room was full of men in suits and one old man in a ruined hat, with a stack of ledgers and a widow in a sharp black dress at his side. Nobody believed he had a chance. Grimm's lawyer spoke first, smooth and unhurried like his client, laying out the water rights deed, the surveys, the county's approval, and making it all sound as certain as sunrise. The law was on his client's side, he said, and the law did not care about sentiment or orchards or old men. Then it was Amos's turn. He stood up slowly, took off his ruined hat, and set it on the table, hole and all. The room went quiet, because a man in a courthouse does not usually take off his hat, and the hole in the crown was plain for everyone to see. "I'm not a lawyer," Amos said. "I'm an orchard keeper. I've kept this valley's water for 40 years, and I've kept a record of it, because my wife's father taught me that a man who waters trees has to understand water, or the trees will teach him the lesson the hard way." He opened the first ledger. "These are my measurements," he said. "Every spring, every summer, every drought, for 40 years. The flow of the river at the north bend, the depth of the spring in the dry months, the rain, the frost, the water table." He opened another ledger. "This is the survey Mr. Grimm's company filed with the county," he said. "It says the river runs full 9 months of the year. It is a lie. I have measured that river every week for 40 years, and it runs full for 4 months, not 9. The other 8, it is a trickle, and the spring is the only thing that keeps this valley alive. If you flood this valley, you will not be building a reservoir. You will be drowning the only water we have." The room was very quiet. The county engineer, a gray man at the back, stood up and asked to see the ledgers. Amos handed them to him, and the engineer turned the pages for a long time. Then he looked up and said, in a voice that carried, "These are consistent, and they do not match the survey Mr. Grimm's company filed, by a wide margin." And then Ruth Calloway stood up, opened her folder, and laid out the death record she had written in her own hand 11 years ago, the deed old Judge Harlow had signed, and the copy Grimm's company had filed. She showed the commission the dates, and she said, quietly, "A dead man cannot sign away water rights 2 years after he is buried. I know, because I wrote down the day he died." The room erupted. Grimm's lawyer was on his feet, shouting, and Grimm himself sat very still at the back with his unhurried smile frozen on his face. The commission called for order, granted the engineer time to verify the ledgers, and Amos Vetch sat down and put his ruined hat back on his head. Ruth sat down beside him, and neither spoke. The verdict came 3 weeks later, and it was not so much a verdict as a collapse. The commission ruled the deed a forgery, the surveys fraudulent. The reservoir would not be built. The water was Amos Vetch's, by right and by record, and the law, which had seemed so certain, had turned out to be paper that could not stand against 40 years of patient measurement. Thaddeus Grimm did not go to prison. The commission was not in the business of prison, but his company lost the valley, its reputation, then its other contracts, and Grimm found himself with nothing left to hurry for. He moved away, and the last anyone heard of him, he was trying to sell a piece of land that was already underwater. He had become, in the end, exactly what he had tried to make of Amos Vetch, a man standing on a flood line, waiting for the water. And Vance Odell did not wait for the verdict. He came to the orchard the night before the hearing, stood at the gate in the dark, looked at the ruined hat on the fence post, and took off his own hat, a fine black hat with a silver band, and hung it on the post beside it. "Tell the old man," he said to the empty orchard, "that I'm done shooting hats." And he rode out of the valley before dawn, and the town never saw him again, because the gunslinger had turned out to be smaller than his laugh, and the old man bigger than his hat. The fence came down the week after the verdict. The men of the town did it themselves, Cobb and Eli and the rest, rolling the wire and pulling the posts, and the river ran free again, and the water came back to the orchard. Amos Vetch stood at the edge of his land with the ruined hat on his head, looking at the river, the burned trees, and the empty space where the fence had been, and Ruth Calloway came and stood beside him, and neither of them spoke. Grimm's lawyer came one last time, with a settlement offer larger than the first. Amos Vetch looked at the paper, then at the river, and said, "I don't want his money. I want my water and my orchard and the right to plant again. That's all I ever wanted." The lawyer blinked. "That's all," he said. "That's all," Amos said. "The rest of it was never mine to take." The lawyer left, and Ruth Calloway looked at Amos. She did not praise him, because she knew he would not want it, but she saw what he had done, and she carried it with her, the way she carried the ledgers. The sheriff, who had thumbed his badge and seen nothing the day the hat was shot off, stood at the back of the hearing room, and when the verdict was read, he took off his own hat and did not put it back on for a long time. And that spring, Amos Vetch planted again. 31 young grafts, the same number the fire had taken, and the town came out to watch him do it. Cobb brought the stakes, Eli brought the water, and Ruth Calloway stood at the end of the row, watching the old man in the ruined hat set each young tree into the ground, thinking about the first time she had seen him standing in the street with his hat shot off, and how wrong the whole town had been. When the last graft was in, Amos stood up and looked at the row of young trees, took off his hat, and looked at the hole in the crown, and Ruth said, quietly, "You could get a new one, you know. The band's worn through. The hole's right through the crown." Amos looked at the hat, and he smiled, a small smile, the first she had seen on him. "A hole in a hat's not a loss," he said. "It's where the light gets in." He put the hat back on his head, and Ruth said, "What are you going to do now, Amos?" He looked at her, and then at the orchard, and then at the river, and he said, "Grafting is a joining. It takes 2 things that can live alone and makes them one thing that can't be broken. I've got a lot of joining to do." And the silver dollar Odell had thrown into the street stayed there for 3 weeks, until Eli the barber brought it to Amos, who put it in his pocket and never spent it, and never threw it away. The sun went down over the valley, and the river ran free, and Amos Vetch walked his rows in the evening the way he had walked them for 40 years, the ruined hat on his head, hole and all. The young trees stood in their rows like a promise, and at the end of the row, where the fence used to be, Ruth Calloway stood watching him. And the last thing she saw, before the dark came down, was the old man stopping at the post where a black hat with a silver band hung, reaching up to touch the brim, once, gently, the way you touch a friend who is leaving, before he turned and walked into the trees. If you'd like to walk with me through another valley, I'll be here next time with the story of a woman who found a letter in a dead man's coat, and the town that tried to send her away, and the one thing she carried that they couldn't take. Until then, keep your people close and keep your word, and I'll see you in the next one.